Welcome to Engineering Data Migration, ensuring a smooth transition for your data, presented by me, Roland Robles. Today we'll be covering 5 key topics. What is a migration? The types of migrations that we see customers need and ask us for. The challenges. I will walk through your 4 most common types of migrations, and I will talk about some of the tools and best practices to have successful migration. Now first, what is a migration? A migration is simply moving data from one location to another. Reasons, some common reasons for migrating data is upgrading to a new PDM version, upgrading your server infrastructure, you might have changes, increasing performance optimization, or in some cases, we see customers that either acquire or divest certain parts of their business and they need to merge or split data that's in their current vault. Now, the benefits of migrating data are generally getting improved performance, getting better collaboration amongst your team, and getting your data in a more secure and more consistent manner. Now let's define the types of migrations that we generally see, and also some of the challenges and the way that we can solve these migrations using the MLC suite of solutions. Now there's 4 basic types of migrations of how we define them. There's what we call unsecured to secure. There's what we call secure to controlled, vault to vault, and vault server to vault server. Now I'm going to walk through each one of these types of migrations, but there is kind of a 5th type of migration that we generally get asked about, and that is when somebody's migrating from one CAD tool to another CAD tool. For example, say you were trying to take a bunch of AutoCAD files and bring them into SOLIDWORKS. Now this is not actually a migration. We call this CAD translation, and so that piece will not be covered in today's session. Let's first start off with what we call an unsecured to secure migration. This is generally speaking when you have data that is currently stored on a local drive on a user's machine, in this case like my C drive, and we've now acquired a central repository, for example a server, and we want to collaborate and put all of our data in one secure server. Now, when you're moving this data from a local machine to a central location, there are some things we want to be aware of. And really, knowledge is power when we're talking about migration. Most of the issues that we see usually arise from people just not realizing of how things actually work. The first thing that we want to be aware of is when moving data, if you have any missing references or you miss any files, you will cause issues in your migration. So what is a reference? A reference inside 3D CAD modeling is the unique way that the files are integrated to each other. In this example, I have this ratchet assembly. This ratchet assembly is composed of essentially 5 components. When opening up this ratchet assembly, these 5 components are pulling and reference back to the main assembly. In layman's terms, what that means is if I were to miss one of these components during my migration, right, moving my files from my local drive to my central server, my assembly on the server is now going to be messed up because it's looking for files that don't physically exist on the server. The same would be true when migrating things like drawings. Drawings have references to the assemblies and the piece parts that they are created from. And we want to be aware that when moving data, we cannot miss any of that key data. If not, that causes what we call a broken reference. And the second thing that you want to be aware of is duplicate files. Duplicate files can cause major issues if the users aren't aware of which files are actually the most current or latest version of those iterations. Anytime we're migrating data, we do have to account for user downtime. Generally speaking, when moving data from one location to another, We don't want users accessing that data because it introduces the ability to corrupt that data. Which leads us to corruption. Again, anytime pushing data through a central network, you do run the risk of corruption. Now, how can we mitigate some of those challenges, and what tools do we have at our disposal to actually move data from one location to another? One way to do that is by simply using Windows copy and paste. In that case, I can go access my folders and simply cut and paste them to my new central server. Now, one of the most secure ways, and one tool that I like that everybody has access to, is actually a tool called RoboCopy. So RoboCopy is a tool that you run via a command prompt that all Windows operating systems have. To use RoboCopy, you would fire off a command prompt, give it your current folder architecture, give it the destination folder architecture, and then run that command called RoboCopy. What that does is it automates that in the background, moving or copying the files from one location to another. One of the big benefits of using RoboCopy is actually gives you a report, and it also has triggers where we can control what files we want to actually move or copy from one location to another. Now, if RoboCopy doesn't provide enough control over your migration, you can always leverage a custom script. In this case, I created a Python script that actually has some more control of moving that data. In this case, it's siphoning through some duplicate folders, and it's actually eliminating some of those files that I had duplicate of and giving me a more detailed report once my script is done running. Now, the last tool that you have at your disposal, right, is say you might look at yourself and say, you know what, I'm just not equipped to do this. I don't want to take on this responsibility. Can you do it for me? Absolutely. So one of the tools that all of our customers has at their disposal is the ability to leverage MLC's consultation services. Generally, when we do something like this, what we do is we break down your migration from just a simple copy and paste into a multi-phase approach project, where we generally evaluate your data. We create a project plan depending on our evaluation of your data. We execute the migration where we actually move your data from point A to point B, and then we confirm that move and give you a report of the service that we provided. Now, the second type of migration that we run across is what we call a secure to a controlled migration. So what does this mean? This means moving your data from a normal Windows architecture into a vaulting tool like SOLIDWORKS PDM. So you might be asking yourself, well, what is a vault? A vault is a tool that is used to control access, versions, revisions, and history inside Windows Explorer. Now, most customers actually own PDM, which is a vaulting tool, and might not even realize that. And so you might already be down the path of, hey, I think using SOLIDWORKS PDM would be a really good option for our organization, but you're not sure how to take all your data that is not currently in PDM and go ahead and move it into PDM. And so now you're at this crossroads. Well, how do I migrate that? Let's talk about some of the challenges of this and then how we can accomplish that. One is anytime you're migrating data from essentially an uncontrolled state into a controlled state, you really do not want to have what we call duplicate files, meaning you have two files that are named the same, but physically might be different and they're stored in different locations. The vault also must be configured with the appropriate permissions to accept any of the metadata from your current file set. Now, metadata is just a fancy way of saying information. Things like part number, description, revision, who approved it, material, weight. That's all metadata that we want to make sure that lands into our vaulting tool. Again, missing references is always a major issue when we're doing migration, whether you're going from a secure to an unsecure or from a secure to a controlled environment. We like to call this garbage in, garbage out. If we're bringing in bad data into the new system, that data is still bad. Remember, a migration is really just the movement of your data. So what are the options if you are on that route of looking at a PDM system? What are your options of migrating all your legacy data from where it's currently stored at into a PDM tool? Well, option one is what we like to call drawing a line in the sand. And what this means is you would manually move your data over time and clean that data up manually using a lot of the same tools that I just talked about, using copy and paste or cut and paste. You could use robocopy. You could write your own custom scripts, or in most cases, what customers do is they might actually look at what we call method 2, which is leveraging us, MLC, one of your partners, to automate that data. So what is the benefit to doing that? Well, in this case, the benefit of using MLC to automate your PDM data migration is that we follow a controlled process that's going to really achieve a handful of things. The first thing we do is we have our own custom tools that give us the ability to actually evaluate your current data set, which is what you're looking at right now. In this case, it gives us a good idea of how many files you have, the total amount of storage that we're going to be needing, and all the different types of files that are in your current folder structure. This gives us a good ability to guesstimate how long your migration might be taking. And most importantly, is along with getting a snapshot of your current data, it's going to give us insight as to any issues that we might want to resolve either during or prior to your migration. In this case, we can see that in my current vault, or in my current folder structure that I'm trying to migrate over into my new vault, there's actually one drawing that is missing a reference. In this case, it gives me the name of the drawing, and it actually gives me the file that it's referenced. And so now I'm at this crossroads where I could try to go find that file manually, or maybe just chalk it up to, the CAD gremlins and say, you know what, I'm not worried about it. We're just going to void that one out and we'll move on without it. In the grand scheme of things, just missing one file is probably not the biggest thing in the world. On top of that, if there is any corruption in your data, meaning you have files that you physically cannot open, they've gotten corrupted somewhere along the way, this gives us an idea if there's any of that data that's currently in your folder structure. Moving forward, we can see if there's any references that it's finding but is outside your normal folder structure. In this case, I can see that this drawing is actually referencing a part that is not in my standard location. More times than not, that's usually in somebody's desktop, is usually what that boils down to. In this case, Windows does have a character limit of 255 characters, which will always cause an issue if you're creating too many subfolders within top-level folders. This gives an idea if you're going to run into that issue. But most importantly, one of the things that I'm almost always looking for is there duplicate file names in the current architecture? And in this case, it gives me an actual report where I can go in and now start evaluating why there is duplicates. Now you might say, hey, this was created by accident. Maybe it was created on purpose. I'm not 100% sure why there's duplicates, but now it gives us a visual into, one, how many they are, and two, where they're physically located in your current folder structure. In this case, we can see that it looks like a user probably accidentally copied a bunch of folders and in turn created a bunch of duplicate part numbers. Now, one of the things that I personally like a lot is this is duplicate files by content. So this actually can go in there and siphon and say, hey, these files are named the same, but is what's in them exactly the same, which gives us this little unique ID. You can almost think of it almost like as a social security number. So if the files have the same ID, that means that they're not only are duplicate files by file name, but they're actually duplicate files by architecture, meaning they're physically the same. And in this case, I can see that almost all of these are duplicate files both by file name and by file structure, which most likely tells me that somebody probably accidentally copied and pasted these. Now, what this does for us is gives us a higher probability to have a more successful migration from your current architecture into your now controlled architecture in PDM. On top of that, it gives us a good idea of how we can set up your vault, so that way your vault is optimized to match up with your current file architecture. Now, one of the requests that we get from time to time is somebody might come to us and say, Roland, we're already using a vault, but we're now looking at using the SOLIDWORKS PDM vaulting tool instead. Really, that falls in line with the same two methodologies that I just covered. One option is you manually move things from your current vault to your new vault. Really, the other option is you can automate that by leveraging your partner, in this case MLC, to automate that data migration. One example of that would be if you were using an end-of-life tool like, say, Workgroup PDM, and now you wanted to get into PDM Standard or PDM Professional. They're two physically different tools. You can almost think of them as two different banks, and you want to move your money from bank one to bank two, and we can be that intermediary for you. Again, leveraging a very similar methodology, we have tools that automate that process. Now, the last type of migration that we're going to cover is what we call a vault server move. This is when you're already using an existing vaulting tool like SOLIDWORKS PDM Standard or SOLIDWORKS PDM Pro. And in most cases, your current server is outdated and you're upgrading your hardware. So you say, Roland, we purchased a new server, or we're moving into one of your dedicated servers. How do we move our current vault from point A to point B? And so here's some things to be aware of as we kind of dig into this. One is that there is the possibility of having downtime. Anytime you're migrating a server from one architecture to another architecture, you really want those users locked out. Two, your database and archives always need to be synced during that migration. If those two things get out of sync, it really introduces some serious issues into the migration. Three, is there is a level of liability. So if this is a task that you're going to take on yourself, I like to think of your vault and files as money. What you're really doing is you're taking on the liability of moving your money from point A to point B, and if something goes awry, those files are important. Again, I like to think of them as dollar bills, so you're just you're taking on that liability of moving that data. And four is compatibility, which this is one of the things that people kind of forget. Is they say, Roland, we bought a new server, it's got a new Windows operating system, it's got a new version of SQL, everything is good, but their old server is so far out of date that the old vault is not compatible with the new operating system. And in that case, it triggers them to not only need a migration, but also have to upgrade their current vaulting tool, meaning upgrading it from, say, PDM 2020 to, say, PDM 2025. So these are all things that we always want to be aware of and kind of keep at the top of our head anytime that we're investigating the act of doing a migration. So what is the process of moving a vault from one server to another server? In other words, from one set of hardware to another set of hardware. The first is, I always recommend installing the PDM tool on the new server. That's generally always step one. You got your new server, let's get everything installed on it. That would include SQL, the license manager, and the PDM services. Second step in the process is actually a multi-phase step. That's backing up the data off of the old server, which is really a three-step process. Step number one is backing up the SQL database tables. So most PDM systems, ours included, uses some sort of database. In our case, we use Microsoft SQL to house all of the metadata for our vault. When migrating a server, we have to go and grab these database backups. Now, a lot of times people will ask me, well, Roland, what are the steps to do that? We do have the steps documented of backing up a database, but it's not a one-size-fits-all set of instructions. The reason being is when you set up a brand new vault from scratch, the way that you name things is really unique to your organization. So what that means is when you come in here into Microsoft SQL Management Studio, your SQL databases might look slightly different than mine, depending on the version of SQL that you're running, and also what you named your vault during the initial creation. In a nutshell, there's always going to be two databases that need to be backed up. One of them will always be called Kinesio Master DB, and the second one is generally going to be called the name of your vault. But again, that is unique to you. I wouldn't know what that is without actually looking at your machine. Both of those databases would need to be backed up from the old server. To have those database backups, you would then need to back up what we call the archive server settings. These are the settings for the server which actually controls the archives. That's just a fancy way of saying the physical files. This is going to be done from the archive server setting configuration, and this is going to back up and create essentially a snapshot of all of your registry entries that PDM is going to need from the server. Again, there is instructions that show you how to run that tool, but that tool is going to look slightly different depending on your setup, right? Depending on what you name things. It is not a universal naming system that would have been dictated during the initial setup of any vault. The last thing is copying the archives, which again is just a fancy way of saying the physical files. So on the server, you're going to see an archive location. Again, kind of mirroring that theme, this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. I would not physically know where your archives are. That would have been dictated during that initial setup of PDM. Now, generally speaking, if you set the default, they're going to be somewhere like in C program files. In my case, I have them on the root level drive of this old server, and it's called C PDM archives. And then in here, you would see a folder structure that would look similar to this, and those files would need to be copied and backed up in preparation for restoring them on the new server. Once you have those three things backed up on the old server, this is where we would go to the new server and restore those items. When those items are restored, there is some manual modification that has to happen. Again, generally speaking, the new server is going to have a different name than the old server. And so for that reason, we have to manually come in here and modify the SQL tables, modify some registries, and then obviously update the licensing to have it installed on the new server. At which point, then we're ready to cut over the client machines. And what that means is physically pointing your clients, right, your end users, the users that are using PDM from the old server to the new server, at which point they would be ready to use the new server. Now, if this seems a little bit overwhelming, let me kind of give you our general migration strategy and our phases of how we accomplish these types of migrations. The first is it's always good to have a plan. Phase one, set up a plan, right? Make sure that you know how to get access to your current vault, and I like to assess your current vault setup and define the goals and the scope of the migration, right? When is this going to be happening? Who's going to be doing what, and who's going to be communicating with the appropriate people. Phase two is generally preparing for your migration. Now that we have a plan in place, this is usually where I go grab the backups and I clean up any old files and any old revisions, and I make sure that that data is all checked into the vault and ready for the copy. Phase three is executing the migration. This is where we usually use our migration tools to move the data from point A to point B. This is also where the users would get locked out of the system while we're doing the work. And then phase four is that post-migration validation. This is where I have the users generally start logging back into the system and making sure that everything is running and changing all of the registry entries on those users' machines to make sure they are pointed to the new server. This is also generally where I turn the old server off, make sure nobody's accidentally trying to access it. Now, if this sounds a little bit overwhelming, that is okay, right? There is solutions out there, right? There's solutions to this. We have a good part of this documented. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all documentation because it is not possible for us to know the names of your database and the names of your server, but the general instructions for this are outlined in an official guide. Now, what are some of the challenges when doing any kind of migration? One, there's always the risk of data corruption. So when we're pushing data from point A to point B, you always just run that risk. The solution to that is making sure that you have implemented good, thorough backups of your data. Downtime. Now, downtime can always be a hot topic when we're talking about migrating data. Now, when customers contract us as a service, we like to use the phase approach where we do an initial migration that does not affect end users and then do what we call a cutover, where we do a delta migration, which is a lot smaller set of data. If you're doing this on your own, one recommendation that I always like to recommend is, if you're not familiar, is try to do it in an off hour to eliminate or minimize that amount of downtime for your users. Again, anytime you're moving data, no matter in what kind of capacity, we generally do not want end users accessing that data when moving. You just introduce the probability of corrupting data. Now, this is one that's always a hot topic, is end users can be resistant to change. So we're migrating from point A to point B, and now things are going to look a little bit different, or they're called a little bit different. Really, the best solution to that is to provide training and support for your end users. Now, there's kind of two capacities that you could do that. You could do it internally, right? Or a lot of our customers like to leverage us as their SOLIDWORKS and CAD and CAM partner, where we can come in and do this and also document this and give your users a little extra end user support. And we have lots of means and methods to do that. One of those would be leveraging our tools like Solid Professor, using our on-site custom training, or even using just our normal tech support mechanism in what we call an extended service agreement. Now, when we're doing migrations, you can always run into the risk of what we call file versioning conflicts. And so what that means is if users have not put their data in the appropriate location, for example, if they haven't yet saved it to the server, or they haven't yet checked it in to the vault, obviously when we migrate that, it's not in the vault, so it's not there to be moved, right? So what I generally recommend is validate and run searches and run reports and clean up any versions prior to doing that migration. Again, for us, we have lots of tools at our disposal that we can do that for you, or you can use some of those open source tools that are already out there provided, on the interwebs. Now, speaking of tools, what are some of those tools that you have access to? Robocopy, which is a command prompt, one that I use quite frequently, using the SOLIDWORKS Pack and Go, using your backup and restore utilities. And then a tool that sometimes people forget about is MLC, right? We are really a tool, and we're a partner of all of our customers. And so if this is one of those things that you're just not competent on, or you just don't feel comfortable doing, you can always leverage us as a tool to do that work for you. Now, best practices that we like to follow, right, is document your migration process. When we do a migration, we generally are going to document and give you that document. When possible, we like to do test migrations in sandbox environments, especially if you have a larger organization with lots of users. It could be worth the time and the money to do a test migration before doing a full production. And one of the absolute key things that I always recommend is communicate with the key stakeholders. For example, making sure that your engineering team and your CAM team and your production team are aware of what you're doing, what the plan is, and what to expect. A lot of times that key communication up front can really eliminate a lot of those back-end challenges when people just don't know what's going on. Now, I'd like to thank you for joining in today's webinar, and what we'll do is we'll take the next few minutes and open it up for any kind of questions or comments that you might have.